To begin, let's get some background information on the Federal Reserve and how it came to be. Between 1775 and 1791, in order to fund the American Revolution, money notes had to be created. Therefore, the U.S. government began printing paper money, which in turn led to inflation, eventually turning the paper notes utterly worthless. After this downfall, the first U.S. bank was established in 1791 in Philadelphia. However, the American people were reluctant to trust in big businesses, so in 1811, Congress refused to renew it by one single vote. Between 1836 and 1865, we know this time period as the free banking era. During this era, state-chartered and unchartered banks became increasingly popular along with demand deposits. Following the free bank era, during the Civil War in 1863, the National Banking Act was put into place, which provided nationally chartered banks. In 1893, the U.S. was put into the worst depression ever seen. The banking system needed reform. Therefore, the National Monetary Commission was established to search for a long-term solution. In 1912, Parker Willis and Carter Glass came up with a bank proposal, which was then enacted by President Woodrow Wilson in 1913. This proposal is today what we call the Federal Reserve.
The role of the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is the central bank of the United States. It performs 5 functions to promote the effective operation of the U.S. economy. Although these 5 functions are very important for what the specific role of the Federal Reserve is, the purpose of the Federal Reserve is to supervise and regulate banks while ensuring the safety and soundness of the nation's financial system. As of March 16, 2020, the current Federal Reserve interest rate is 0% to 0.25%. Although not much has changed over the years regarding the role of the Federal Reserve, the Fed will always supervise and regulate banks and other important financial institutions to ensure the safety of the nation's banking and financial system.
Monetary policy. These are policies created by the Federal Reserve that affect money supply and credit. Monetary policy changes the growth of money supply to create an environment of full employment and stable prices. For example, the recession. The Federal Reserve stimulates the economy by buying bonds. This increases bank reserves and money supply, which lowers interest rates and makes loans more accessible. This evidently increases spending, which in turn increases real GDP and decreases unemployment rates. Monetary policy contains 4 tools, the first being open market operations. This is the purchases or sales of U.S. government securities by the Federal Reserve System for the purpose of increasing or decreasing the money supply and changing credit conditions. The Fed can expand the money supply by buying Treasury bonds and can contract it by selling them. When the Fed buys the bonds, the money is given to an individual seller, and the former owner deposits some of the money into the banks, which evidently increases the money supply. Although open market operations is the most prevalent tool, there are 3 other tools involved. The second tool is the discount rate. This is the interest rate charged by the Federal Reserve when institutions borrow money. By being in control of this rate, the Federal Reserve can monitor money supply and credit. The third tool is required reserve ratio. This is the percent of bank deposits that the Fed requires the banks to keep. This number is rarely altered, which keeps the money supply stable. The last tool is an interest on excess reserves. This is interest paid by the Fed to the banks on required and excess reserves. It was originally designed to reduce implicit tax on banks, which are now much smaller due to the tax. Because the Federal Reserve pays interest on excess reserves, the reserves of the Fed are more enticing. Therefore, the banks will keep more funds deposited into the Federal Reserve, therefore maintaining money supply. Each of these tools is vital to monitor and maintain the credit and money supply.
Fiscal policy is the deliberate change in spending and taxes by the federal government in efforts to influence economic conditions in the economy. If the government spending is greater than tax revenue, then there's a shortage. If tax revenue is greater than government spending, then there's a surplus. When government spending and transfer payments increase, real GDP, employment, and prices rise. When income taxes increase, real GDP, employment, and prices fall.
There are two types of fiscal policies. There's contractionary and expansionary fiscal policies. For contractionary, it's used to fix booms. Therefore, to slow growth and spending in an economy, a government can increase taxes, decrease government spending on goods and services, or decrease government transfer payments. For an expansionary fiscal policy, it's used to fix recessions. Therefore, to stimulate spending in an economy, a government can lower taxes, increase government spending on goods and services, or increase government transfer payments.
The Taylor rule in regards to the Federal Reserve and monetary capital runs on the basic equation that the federal funds rate is equal to long-run federal funds rate target. And that long-run federal funds rate target is 1.5 times the quantity of inflation rate minus inflation rate target, which then translates into 0.5 times the output gap in percentage points. Altogether, this is where output gap is equal to the quantity of GDP minus trend GDP divided by trend GDP, all times 100. And within the Taylor rule, there are two non-trivial parts taught. The first being how the Fed should raise the federal fund rate by 1.5 percent points for each 1% increase to the inflation rate. The role of this is to correct inflation rates within the country. The second part is that the Fed should raise the federal funds rate 0.5 percent points for each 1% increase in the output gap. This is so the gap is adjusted accordingly to the current monetary status of the country's output gap.
Costs and benefits of federal budget deficits, surpluses, and debt. Federal budget deficits. The costs are that it can result in a bad economy because the country may prioritize off the debt and interest, and it can also reduce investments. The benefits are that it forces growth in the economy by creating more employment, and it forces the government to have more control on spending because of high interest rates. Also, it provides protection for the country and allows more money for armed forces. The costs and benefits of surpluses are the costs are high level for inflation. It can lower future income, and it can degrade national resources. And the benefits are that it creates more jobs for the domestic economy. It lowers government spending, and it higher tax revenues. The federal debt, there's only costs for this one, and it lowers national savings and income. There's higher interest, and more of a risk of a fiscal crisis.